What's up, WAP? Good morning. It is Tuesday morning, and we are going over Unit 3, Part 2, which is in the time period 1450 to 1750. Um, we have a couple units that go through this exact same time period, and I really don't want us thinking in the context of units. I want us thinking in the context of time periods because obviously on the AP test, you guys aren't going to be given a unit, you're going to be given a time period, between this time and this time, what's going on, and you need to be able to answer the question. And so in general, that's why these themes are very, very important. I have themes for each and every time period. For this time period, a lot goes on. We have a lot of themes. In part one, we talked about Asia. We talked about China specifically still dominating Asia in the Ming Dynasty and in the Qing Dynasty, but China is going through some changes that's going to lead to a slow economic decline, especially after Zhang He's voyages and going into isolationism. Japan has unified together, and then the rest of these themes in this time period is really all about Europe because we see the emergence of Europe in this time period, completely out of feudalism and into the nation states that start to dominate the globe because of the age of exploration and colonization. But before they go out and explore, they need to come together and centralize their governments. To be able to have mercantilism, to be able to have these very centralized economies that are based upon bringing gold and silver back to the state, you need to have a state that can regulate trade. You need to have a state that can unify its people because for so long, Europe was this decentralized continent of different regional kings and feudalism. And so, what we have in this time period first, before the age of exploration, which will be next unit, is our European nation states emerging under absolute monarchs. And we see this in Spain and France and England and Russia. And of course, when we see the rise of the power of kings, they're going to compete with the most powerful entity in Europe, in Western Europe, which of course is the Catholic Church. And so our previous time period, the Catholic Church won that battle. Look at the lay investiture controversy, for instance, when the king and the pope went head to head on who has the power to appoint bishops. And at that lay investiture controversy, at the Concordat of Worms, it was decided only the pope has that power. Well, now something is going to weaken the Catholic Church that is going to bring about the rise of these absolute monarchs. And that is our Protestant Reformation, which weakens the church. It also is going to bring war to Europe. And so the states becomes more powerful than the religion. And then also the local elites, things like the nobles. Okay, so specifically from this lecture today, we're going to focus on this essential question. How did rulers in Europe legitimize and consolidate their power? Our previous time period, we had feudalism. We had the power of the Catholic Church. In this time period, we're going to see the rise of divine kings. And of course, because Western Europe is so Catholic, divine kings are going to be claiming that they have gotten their power from God and that they are bestowed their power to rule over their people in the name of God, but also to administer now their nation states. These kings are going to control large aspects of the state. They're going to create new bureaucrats to collect taxes. They're going to control the nation's army and sometimes use that army to go into wars with other states. And they're going to control aspects of the religion. This is uniform with all of our rulers that we learn about in this time period. So when you think about analyzing European states in this time period, it's good to think of it this way. How are they taxing? How is the state leader controlling religion? Those sort of things. And then as the state leader gets more and more power, when we look at our upcoming time period, that's where we're going to have revolutions against the king because the king has too much power and the citizens want more power. So, when we look at history from this lens, you can see we've seen the kings had no power in the previous time period. Here, the kings have the most power that they've ever had. And then in our next time period, we have revolutions against the king. So here we are, 1450 to 1750. And we'll start in England. And in England, we see that the English kings are starting to centralize their power by creating bureaucrats to help them administer their nation state. These bureaucrats are called justices of the peace. They're selected to maintain the peace. They start as kind of royal sheriffs, and the kings, our English kings, they didn't have a tremendous amount of power early on. Remember, as we move through and out of feudalism, we're going to see the process be very slow. We're going to have nobles, noble families that have commanded over their peoples for over 100 years, hundreds of years. And they're not going to easily give up power, and it's going to take time. And that was something that William the Conqueror had to deal with. He conquered England, and then he wanted to use his royal sheriffs to command the country. Well, many people resisted him, and so he had to use force and say, "You're going to follow my law, or I'm going to use violence to stop you," right? And so that's what these English kings are doing. They're bringing in these justices of the peace. And at first, the English kings allowed the nobles to select these justices, but over time, these justices became loyal really only to the king. They were loyal sheriffs. They became judges of the realm. When the English Parliament was created, these justices of the peace became members of Parliament. And we think about the different states in Europe. It's nice to be able to say, okay, they all have these divine kings, they all have bureaucrats, they all use religion to control their states, and that's all true. But we also need to know the difference between these European states. And England is really the most democratic of Europe at this stage. They have a parliament. They also have that document signed by King John, which back in 1215, which was the Magna Carta. And while our average everyday citizens of Europe really didn't have a lot of power at all, most of the people in Europe have no political power. But in England, at least there are some fundamental rights that are guaranteed to the people. And one is that only Parliament has the power to levy taxes, that the king has to consult Parliament. And the other is habeas corpus, the right to a fair trial, the right to not just be thrown in jail by the king. And so, these bureaucrats here are the king gaining more power. And then we see the controversy with James I. Now, James I is a king of the Stuart family. He's the king of England, and he's going to be the first guy that's going to start to kind of contradict the Magna Carta and the rights that these English citizens are supposed to have. James I writes a book. He writes a book called The True Law of Free Monarchy. And in The True Law of Free Monarchy, he states that the king has power to make the laws and has unquestioned power. And that unquestioned power is the scary thing to many English citizens because, well, okay, yes, the king has lots of power, but is it unquestioned? Because there is an entity in England that can question the king's power, and that, of course, is Parliament. And so this here seems to contradict the Magna Carta. And sure enough, James I believed that he was, in fact, a divine king and had the divine rights of kings, and that he only had to answer to God and no mortals, including Parliament. And this is going to heavily shape the history of England, because we're going to see that through this conflict, through James I and then his son Charles I, we're going to see the English people develop a resentment for the power of the king. And this becomes heavily embedded in what it means to be English. And our American colonists, who of course are English, coming over to the New World in our next time period, are going to take this resentment for the king with them and their belief that they have individual rights as citizens. These are called our civil liberties. And so this is an important concept in England, guys. We're starting with James I, who calls himself a divine king. His son, Charles I, is the guy that's going to get everybody into trouble, because Charles I, he's a very powerful dude. He's the king of England. He's the king of Scotland. He's the king of Ireland. And of course, because his dad was James I, he is a believer in the divine right of kings. But here we are in the 30 Years' War, which is an immense religious conflict all throughout Europe, where we have fighting between Protestants and Catholics. And England is Protestant because of King Henry VIII breaking away from the Catholic Church. And so Charles I really wants to participate in the 30 Years' War. He really wants to fight in the name of Protestantism. But as we know, wars are expensive. And so he wants to raise taxes in order to participate in this war. Now, Parliament refuses. Parliament says, no, we're not going to raise taxes. And so he famously is going to dismiss Parliament and raise taxes on his own. And if people disagree with him, he's going to quarter soldiers in their homes, meaning I'm going to station soldiers in your homes to watch over him. And if you speak out against him, he's going to throw you in jail without a charge. And so obviously what he's done here is he has completely disrespected the Magna Carta and acted completely on his own. And yet, even as he's done this, and even as he's gotten taxes from the people illegally, he still is having trouble getting all the money he needs. And so Parliament is going to come up with a really smart move. They're going to say, perhaps if we can lure him in to committing to acknowledging our power as Parliament, we'll get him the money he needs. And so they compel Charles to sign something called the Petition of Right. It's a document, it's created by Parliament, and it pretty much just says the same things that the Magna Carta says. It says you can't tax the people without Parliament's consent, you can't quarter soldiers in people's homes, and you have to give the people the right to a fair trial, habeas corpus. And so Charles, he needs the money. And so he says, sure, why not? I'll sign this Petition of Right. What's the harm? I only have to listen to God anyway. And so he signs this document. He gets the money he needs from Parliament. And then he proceeds to completely ignore the document. He is going to disband Parliament again the next year. There's going to be people in the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament, that are going to protest him doing this. He's going to have them arrested, and he is going to rule the next 11 years as an absolute monarch, listening to nobody else but himself and to God. But then another religious conflict, the Scottish rebel. The Scottish rebel against control by the Anglican English. And so Charles, once again, is going to have to try to put down a rebellion and use force. And so he needs money again. And so here we are, 10 years after he has disbanded Parliament. He's going to come tail between his legs back to Parliament, and he's going to say, I need money. Can you raise taxes? Can you help me get money to put down this rebellion? And Parliament refuses. And Parliament by this time now has a very outspoken Puritan that was elected to it called Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is a very, very devout Puritan. And Puritans want to purify their church, especially in this case, the Anglican Church. Oliver Cromwell believes that Charles I is not serving the best interests of God. He says that our church needs to be purified. And because of this, Oliver Cromwell is going to openly criticize Charles as being corrupt. He's saying, you are violating our Constitution, you are violating God's will. And so now we have Parliament starting to speak out against their own king, and that's not a good thing. And then to make matters worse, over in Ireland now, which is heavily Catholic, they start breaking out in revolutions. So now the Scottish are rebelling, the Irish are rebelling. Both are supposed to be controlled by England. Both are supposed to be controlled by Charles I. And so now Parliament is going to blame Charles for all this. Oliver Cromwell is going to say, it is your fault, Charles, that we have uprisings in Scotland and Ireland. And so Charles is going to declare war on his own Parliament. Here we go. We have a civil war in our hands, one side of the country fighting the other. It's going to be people that are loyal to Parliament, and then versus the people that are loyal to the royalty. That means, of course, that the English Civil War are our parliamentarians versus our royalists. Very simple. Our parliamentarians are led by Oliver Cromwell. Our royalists, of course, are led by Charles I. In a long war, a 9-year war, the royalists are defeated. Charles I is captured. He is tried for crimes against the state. He is found guilty. He is convicted for high treason. Charles' only defense in the actual trial is that the trial was illegal itself, that he could only be tried by God, and the people aren't having that anymore. And so he is sentenced to death. He gets to visit his children one more time, and then he is beheaded in 1649. They cut off his head with the broadsword. And this is a momentous moment in history because the English are saying, yes, our kings, they have a connection to the divine. Yes, they do. They are divine kings. We are going to listen to them. They can make the laws, but there are some rights that we have. There are some fundamental rights that are guaranteed to us by the Magna Carta and then the Petition of Right that the king cannot violate. And so this becomes a very, very important and sacred thing to the English people. And again, our American colonists, who of course are English, are going to resent the fact that Britain in the 18th century continues to raise taxes while they don't have consent in Parliament. They say this is a violation of the Magna Carta and the Petition of Right. Okay, so Oliver Cromwell now, after you fight a war to put down an oppressive, absolute tyrant, you then are going to seize power for yourself and become the Lord Protector. And that's exactly what Oliver Cromwell does. England writes a new constitution and he tears it up and says, I am the leader now, and rules as a dictator for the next 11 years. And finally he dies. And then his son, Richard, becomes the ruler of England, and he's unpopular. And so now Parliament is going to say, we need to do something about this. And so they are going to go behind Richard Cromwell's back, and they're going to reach out to Charles I's son. Yes, Charles I, the guy whose head they cut off. They're going to reach out to his son, Charles II, and they're going to say, why don't you come out of exile and come and rule our country? And Charles II does just that. On his 30th birthday, he comes back to England. There's a parade in London, and he takes the power back for himself and rules as king. And he rules all the way until his death. He dies, and when he dies, his brother, James II, is going to succeed him. But there is a big issue in England when James II takes the throne, because James II is Catholic. And this creates a huge contradiction, because the kings of England are supposed to be the head of the Anglican Church. They are supposed to be the head of the Church of England. And so we can't have a Catholic as the head of a Protestant church. That can't happen. And James then starts enacting laws that are very tolerant of Catholics, and England can't have this. And so Parliament is going to go behind James II's back, and they're going to reach out to monarchs living in the Netherlands. They're going to reach out to William of Orange from the Netherlands. And as the drama unfolds, William of Orange, of all people to be married to, is married to Mary II, which just so happens to be James's daughter. So to summarize, Parliament is now sending an invitation to monarchs in the Netherlands, William of Orange and Mary II, who is the daughter of the current King of England, to come take the throne, to march on England. And that is exactly what happens. William and Mary come to England to take the throne in the name of Protestantism. The only problem with James is that he's Catholic, but that is a big problem according to the English Parliament. And here come William and Mary. They come to take the throne. James is going to flee. And because of this, we have a bloodless revolution. We have no fighting ensuing. This is why this is called the Glorious Revolution. Now that William and Mary are very happy that they were invited by Parliament to rule over, at this point, the strongest country in the world, they are going to be asked by Parliament to sign the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights, once again, is going to limit the power of the monarchs in the eyes of the people. It ensures individual liberties that people have. One such example, habeas corpus, the right for a trial, also requiring Parliament's permission to levy taxes or to raise an army. Okay, so we have all these protections from English civil liberties. When we look at England, yes, the power of the monarch has increased in this time period, certainly, but so has the power of the people in this time period. Okay, and now we go to France. Now, France, very much similar in many ways. Again, France is the power of the king is rising. The power of the king to administer his empire with tax collections is rising. The power of the king to command some sort of religious power of the people is rising. But France is different than England. France is different than England, and one of the biggest reasons that France is different than England is because of the tax system. The tax system in England, everybody pays taxes. The tax system in France, only one of the three estates pays taxes. We have our first estate, the clergy. They pay no taxes. They have a large amount of land proportionally to their very small amount of people in France. The nobles, the second estate, they don't pay taxes. They have even more land. The people, 98% of society, the third estate, the commoners, the bourgeoisie, pay all the taxes. right? And that's our situation in France. And so obviously this creates a much different social dynamic. Now, in France, we have the Bourbon family that is ruling over the throne, of course, and we start with Louis XIII. And what Louis XIII is going to do that is very smart, and we learn very little about Louis XIII. But one of the things that he does is he rules through a cardinal. He rules through a Catholic official, and by doing this, this helps him get the power and respect of the people, because then the people view the king, they view the royalty as having the will of God, right? Which is key. We see this in all these different European states, and this is how France does it. Louis XIII is going to rule through his minister, Cardinal Richelieu. And Cardinal Richelieu, his main goal as the minister of Louis XIII is to strengthen the power of the king, to make sure that the monarchy is the unquestioned power. We have fully transitioned out of feudalism. And Richelieu's big contribution is creating a system of intendants. They're very much similar to the justices of peace in England. They are bureaucrats. They're there to collect taxes, and they're there to make sure that the people of France listen to the law of the king. These are tax farmers, which means that they can come in and collect taxes in a given area. They get to keep those taxes for themselves, but they have to pay a portion of them back to the French government. Who are they collecting taxes from? Again, only the third estate. The nobles and the clergy don't have to pay taxes. And because of this, the nobles and the clergy are almost kind of outside the realm of the law. They are almost like they don't have to follow the law. And this is going to go until this guy, Louis XIV, the Sun King. This guy, the most famous king of France, he is going to rule for 72 years. This guy is a very, very important figure in European history in general, especially in French history, because this is the guy that believes himself to be a true divine king, one of the most powerful kings in world history, because he doesn't believe he needs to consult the people. He doesn't believe he has to consult the French Parliament, which is called the Estates General. He believes he makes the laws and administers the justice. This is summarized in his famous line, "L'État c'est moi," which means "I am the state." He is going to do many things to expand the power of the monarch. Everything is about glorifying himself. He is going to go into many wars, which we'll see, get engaged in many wars with England especially. But he's also going to try to solidify his power by doing two things. One, by solidifying his power through art and magnificence, and the other is by trying to diminish the power of the nobles, who still obviously have a tremendous amount of power in France, given that they don't pay taxes. He's going to accomplish both of these things with the construction of the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles is $2 billion now, adjusted to inflation. It is huge. It's 3 miles of grounds, 700 rooms, most of the furniture made out of pure silver. I mean, this is pure elegance. And it is certainly going to glorify his power and show this guy is the most powerful and rich monarch. He needs to be respected. You need to bend down and kiss his toes. All of these things. I mean, this guy's the real deal. But of course, it's also going to create some longstanding resentment for the monarch, because who is paying the taxes to pay for this incredibly expensive palace? The third estate. But the other way in which the Palace of Versailles is going to help him keep his power and strengthen the power of the monarch is because he invites the nobles, and in fact kind of compels the nobles of France to come in and live with him in this palace. And because they come in and live with him in the palace, he is able to keep watch over them each and every day. And these nobles aren't whispering in the ears of the people of their lands throughout France. You know, if you bring in someone from the northern regions of France and say, come on over here and live with me in the capital, come and live with me in Versailles, no longer are those people looking to the noble as to what to do or what laws to follow. Now they're looking to the king. And so this is a really, really smart move by Louis XIV, because now the nobles are constantly fighting for his attention and respect. He has thus, strengthened the power of the king in relation to the nobles. Some pictures of the palace, beautiful palace. And so now we compare England and France between 1450 and 1750. In England, the power of the monarch's growing. but so did the power of the people, power of parliament. In France, the Bourbon family, especially Louis XIV, that we just talked about, has become an absolute monarch. They brought the nobles under the control of the king, although nobles and clergy still don't pay taxes. But what about the stepsister to the east, Russia? And Russia, as we know in this time period, guys, often is much, much behind. They're far behind the rest of Europe. And actually, this time period and the following time period, they're behind the rest of Europe. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is the Mongols. The Mongols come in, Batu Khan come in and conquer the Russian city-states, and they control them for over 100 years. And because of this, Russia is going to have to pay tribute. That's going to drain wealth out of Russia. But also more than that, they didn't, because they're controlled by the Mongols, they didn't participate in the Renaissance. So we didn't see this emerging of a middle class that we see with the Renaissance. And with the emerging middle class in places like England and France, we see feudalism fading away. We see no more need for serfdom. But in Russia, we don't see that. We still see serfs. The Russians are the last to abolish their serfs. And it creates this terrible inequality and poverty where most of the people of Russia own no land and work for somebody else. And so Russia, because of that setup, is oftentimes much poorer than the rest of Western Europe. And the other thing is Russia's location. When you look at where Russia is on this map, you can see that Russia is lots of its boundaries are the Arctic Ocean, some really, really cold places where most of the year you can't sail out of there. You can't trade from there because the water is frozen. It's very dangerous. There's glaciers. So how can you then trade with the rest of the world? Well, still over here, it's too cold, right? So Russia is constantly looking for ways in which to control the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea so that they can trade with the rest of the world, especially Western Europe. When we look at this time period, 1450 to 1750, this is where we start to see the Atlantic trade. This is where we start to see the era of colonization, where places like England and especially Spain and Portugal in this time period developed colonies around the world and created a tremendous amount of wealth. Well, Russia misses out on that because of its location, because it doesn't have areas where it can go out and colonize overseas. And still instead, Russia in this time period is just going to expand east. It's going to expand into Siberia. It's going to make its way across the Bering Strait over into Alaska. But these aren't the tremendously wealthy locations that are conquered by Spain and Portugal and France and England. So Russia, fighting against some serious setbacks or handicaps in this time period. And so going through a little bit of context, going back to 1250, we had the Mongols arriving in 1240, destroying Kiev, Batu and the Golden Horde. Russian princes were allowed to stay in power, but they had to collect taxes and pay some of that tribute to the Mongols. But one city-state, Moscow, we're kind of right in the middle over here in this map, is going to start collecting some taxes on the sides. They're going to collect extra taxes, and then they're going to raise an army. They're going to rally the city-states of Russia and lead the Russians in the Battle of Kulikovo, pushing out Batu Khan, and then establishing a independent Russia. Now, at this stage, we still see Russian city-states, but Moscow is going to start leading the Russian city-states and eventually evolve into a nation-state Russia. How, then, is Moscow going to rule over the rest of the Russian city-states? One of the ways that we see all of our European states is going to be the control of religion. Russia has always been, or has been since for hundreds of years, Eastern Orthodox Christian. They got this from our Byzantine Empire, who was their neighbor to the south. What Moscow is going to start to do in this time period is they are going to claim that their rulers in Moscow are now the rulers of the new Russian Orthodox Church. The Byzantine Empire is falling to the Ottoman Turks. And so now, without the Orthodox Church centered in Constantinople, Russia takes the torch, so to speak, as being the new Orthodox Christianity center. And our leaders of Moscow are going to start calling themselves czars. And czar is Russian for Caesar. They're looking at Western Europe as their rulers, saying we are the Caesars of Russia, and we are now the leaders of the new Russian Orthodox Church. And so Moscow now kind of is making this move to become the divine kings, like we see in England, like we see in France. One such ruler that does this effectively is Ivan IV. Ivan IV is going to really raise the power and prestige of Russia and Moscow, because he's going to expand Russia eastward. He's going to move into these lands that are still controlled by the Mongols, coming into Central Asia, and adding this land to Russia. And they're doing this by relying on gunpowder. And so Russia starts to move into, especially these areas over here, Siberia. And this is important because Russia, their economy needs something to trade. And what's over there in Siberia is furs. Lots and lots of animals, especially beaver furs. Is there a way in which the Russians can control this valuable fur trade? That's going to get them some wealth. And so obviously Ivan IV wants to expand east into Siberia. He doesn't yet have the wealth to do this. Yes, he's calling himself the Tsar. Yes, he's calling himself the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. But many people are still skeptical. It takes time to accept a new divine king as the ruler. And so, he doesn't have the wealth or the prestige to go out and conquer all of these new lands. And so in Russia, the big difference is that we always constantly see that the Russian boyars, the nobles, are going to have a tremendous amount of influence over politics. This is why in Russia that we see feudalism so long, that we see serfdom so long, because the Russian boyars want serfdom. They want people working their lands. And so Ivan IV has to come to a rich boyar family here, the Stroganov family, and he says, can you help us conquer those lands in Siberia? So the Stroganov family, they've got money to spend. And they said, why don't we hire those half-Mongol mercenaries over there in the eastern portions of Russia, the Cossacks. Let's hire those mercenaries to go out and conquer the lands to the east in the name of Russia. We'll pay them handsomely, and then we'll control the fur trade there. And that's exactly what happens. And so now Russia has expanded east. They have not only gained control of the fur trade, they've also control of the Volga River, which flows into the Caspian Sea. Now that gives them access to trade with Persia and the Ottoman Empire. Not two of the areas that are richest areas in the world right now, but they're expanding their trade routes, which is going to help Russia become a stronger centralized state. Talking about moving into Siberia, as we move further east into Siberia, we start to see indigenous tribes, very much like you would see in the North America, Native Americans. We see all indigenous people living in Siberia that have been living in pretty much isolation for their entire history. Just like we see with our Native Americans in North America, we see Europeans are going to have two distinct advantages over their indigenous tribes. One, gunpowder weapons. Two, disease. And disease, unfortunately, is going to wipe out many peoples of indigenous tribes along the way. The people that aren't wiped out initially by disease or gunpowder weapons are going to be looked to be converted by Russian missionaries, which is another thing that we see in North America as well. Russia moving into Alaska, they move all the way down to California by 1814. So Russia expands east tremendously during this time period. And also, Ivan IV is going to look to consolidate power within Russia itself. And so most of the Russian city-states have accepted Moscow as the new ruler. Moscow, again, evolves right into Russia. One of the states that is a longtime rival of Moscow is going to resist, and that is Novgorod. If you look at these maps, it's really telling. So Moscow's in blue, and it's one of the many Russian city-states. 100 years later, Moscow has expanded heavily. By the time we get to 1500, which is pretty much the end of Ivan IV's reign, we see that Moscow is Russia. That is, it evolves into a modern-day Russia. But one of the things we learn about this process is while most Russian city-states are going to go quietly, Novgorod is not. They're going to challenge him. The boyars there are going to challenge them. So Ivan IV marches in with an army, he confiscates their land, and then he forces the nobles to come in and move to Moscow so that he can keep an eye on them. And this, of course, is exactly what Louis XIV is doing over there in France. It's the same thing, actually, that the Tokugawa shogunate, Tokugawa Ieyasu, is doing to the Japanese daimyo. He's forcing them to come in and move to Tokyo to watch over them. So this is common practice throughout the world to keep the power of the nobles at bay to strengthen the power of the central government. The Russian social classes, again, obviously the Tsar at the top, and then we have our boyars, who are our noble landowning class that keep power in Russia for a long time. We do have some merchants in the middle, although much fewer than places like the Middle East or Europe. And then we have our peasants. They are a huge peasant class, and the peasant class really falls into two categories. You are either a peasant that is not in debt, or you are a peasant that's in debt that can't pay off your debt. And if you're a peasant that's in debt that can't pay off your debt, you are in fact a serf. Because you can't pay off your debt, you are tied to the land, and because you are tied to that land, you are sworn that you will protect or provide food for a noble, and in return that noble will protect you. This, of course, is feudalism. Feudalism in Russia goes much longer than any other place in Europe. These serfs have very little freedom. They can be traded, they can be sold. So obviously inequality in Russia. Ivan IV, he was great in the ways of expansion. He was great in the way of strengthening the power of the Tsar in Russia. But where he gets his nickname is not for greatness. He isn't called Ivan the Great. He is called Ivan the Terrible. And he's called Ivan the Terrible because of his demeanor, because of his fits of rage that he would get into. He was a very paranoid man. And so he is going to do one thing that has a very lasting impact on Russia, and that's establishing the Oprichnina, which is Russia's first secret police. It's this military force of men in black that rode black horses that answered only to Ivan. And if someone was speaking out against Ivan IV or perhaps plotting to overthrow him, he would use the Oprichnina to come in and watch the boyars, arrest the boyars. This is what is going to inspire the secret police in Russia. And then the other thing with Ivan IV is that in one of his fits of rage, he kills his only son. And when he does this, this creates a huge secession dispute in Russia. Who is now our new czar? You've spent all this time centralizing the power of the Tsar, adding to the growing power of the Tsar, and yet now we don't have someone to rule in your stead. And so this is going to create a time of anarchy in Russia after Ivan IV's rule, where who will be the next Tsar? This is a very troubled time, and so the Russians call this the time of troubles. What do we do? Russia is in this state of near anarchy. At the Zemsky Sobor, a national assembly, the boyars from the entire country come together and decide that Michael Romanov will be their new leader, their new czar. And this starts the Romanov family ruling Russia, and it will go from this moment, 1613, all the way until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The Romanovs will rule Russia. And one of the most important rulers in Russian history, perhaps the most important, is a Romanov, and his name is Peter the Great. Peter the Great, just like Ivan IV before him, is going to work to add to the power of the Tsar in relation to the power of the nobles of Russia. How does he do this? We've got three groups that are just jockeying for power, fighting for power in Russia. One is the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, very devout country. So obviously we're going to see the clergy have a tremendous amount of power there. The boyars, of course, and then the Tsar. We see that Peter, he's one of 13 kids, Peter the Great, and so he is going to have to fight for his power. One of the people that resist him is his half-sister, Sophia. Sophia is going to band with the nobles. They're going to bring the Streltsy to come in and try to overthrow Peter. So the Streltsy's boyar-led military forces. Peter is going to overcome this. He's going to defeat the Streltsy. He's actually going to have to, 10 years later, defeat another rebellion by the Streltsy. But by doing this, Peter has solidified his power over the nobles. This is a big victories by Peter against his sister. He doesn't kill his sister, but he forces her into a convent where she becomes a strict nun. She's a complete isolation for 364 days out of the year. She gets one day, Easter, each day, where she can leave the convent and be with other people. So Peter, he has defeated the boyars, the Streltsy, and then he looks to take major moves to raise his power in relation to the church. The last patriarch is going to die. And when the patriarch dies, this is the leader of the Orthodox Church. And so now that the patriarch has died, it is now the obligation of Peter to establish a new patriarch. He doesn't do this. He doesn't establish a new patriarch. Instead, he says, we will have a group of bishops that will now rule over the church, not one powerful archbishop, the Pope, the patriarch. So he establishes the Holy Synod, which is a group of bishops that are loyal to him. And this is brilliant, of course, in the constraints of ruling a country, because now what you've done is you've established somewhat of a divine monarch. The Tsar is now the head of the church as well. He is going to then weaken the church further by raising the minimum age of monks to 50. You cannot be a monk until you're 50 years old. And so people that would have become monks are now going to become soldiers or become workers for the government. Obviously, people that are very devout are going to be opposed to these changes. And these people are called the old believers. And they're going to, want to fight back for the more traditional values of the Russian Orthodox Church. The other thing about Peter is that he loves Western Europe. He wants to model Russia after Western Europe. Western Europe, here we are, look at this date up here, 1697, right? This is towards the end of this time period. And Western Europe is by far the richest area in the world right now, because we see that the English have established the British East India Company over there in India, and the Dutch have the Dutch East India Company, and the Spanish controls most of North America, and the Portuguese are making all this money from Brazil. And here's Peter in Russia, where they're, moving into Siberia to control the fur trade, right? We don't have a lot of wealth or prosperity over here in Russia. And so Peter wants Russia desperately to be able to be like Western Europe. And so he's going to go out and visit Western Europe, study the Dutch and English navies and merchant ships. He's going to hire technicians from Germany and England, come in, help us build a navy. And then once he builds a navy, the first thing that he's going to do is use his new military to come in and take land from Sweden and form St. Petersburg here. And St. Petersburg is important because it is a warm water port, and he has brought trade with Western Europe by seizing this, by doing this. We now have this new shipyards in St. Petersburg where we can trade through the Baltic Sea over to the rest of Europe. And so Peter has this great contribution here. He desperately wants to build this new city, this very modern new city. He builds it off of Western Europe, models it after Western Europe, not after the other Russian cities. He's also going to conscript peasants, to come in and work in this city, meaning he's going to essentially draft them to come work there. This is also where the Winter Palace is built. It's built after Peter's death, but it becomes another symbol of the Tsar. Getting back to these peasants, Peter, while he raises the power of the Tsar in relation to the nobles, he raises power in relation to the Tsar to the church, he also is going to raise power in relation to the Tsar to the peasants and the serfs. And what that means is that the peasants and the serfs are going to become more oppressed than ever in Peter's reign. One of the examples of this is forcing peasants, conscripting them, meaning drafting them, to come in and build St. Petersburg. And I'll get more into that when we talk about the economy. St. Petersburg, one of the lasting contributions of Peter, of course, it becomes the connection to Western Europe this way. However, there still is no warm water ports in the East, and the warm water ports in the East would be great because you want to be able to trade with, of course, China and India for all those spices and silks and all those things. Peter is also going to go as far as to try and adopt the actual clothing styles of Western Europe. He's going to make the nobles tailor their sleeves He's also going to make the men, especially very devout Russian men, would grow their beards really long. They had religious significance. He's going to make the men shave their beards. He's actually going to have a beard tax. If you would like a beard, you must pay a special tax. And so this is how far Peter is going to grow to emulate Western Europe. Another way that he does this is with women. Women traditionally wore veils, and they were not allowed to go in and attend social gatherings. There was also arranged marriages in Russia. Peter's going to change all of this. He says the women in Western Europe are more free. They don't wear veils. They can marry on their own free will. And so this modeling of Western Europe benefits one group specifically. It's going to benefit the women of Russia. Okay, back to the economy, because this is important. It has some really long-lasting impacts on Russia. Peter is going to start, obviously, wanting to compete with the rest of Europe as far as having these modern navies. He is going to want to build shipyards in St. Petersburg. He wants to build a navy. He wants to trade with lots of Western Europe. We finally have this warm water port, and so he wants these massive ships to be built there. And so he wants people to build these ships. Well, he's a czar, but he's got people working for him, but he wants a lot more people to work for him. How is he going to get people to come in and start building these ships? He is going to change the taxes. He is going to, instead of saying, okay, I'm placing a tax on each noble's lands, and that noble has to pay a certain amount of taxes that, of course, are given to him by his serfs working that land. Now I'm going to say I'm going to change the taxes. So taxes are now going to be placed on each and every individual working on that land. And so what he's going to do is he's going to raise taxes. And the people that are going to feel the brunt of this raise of taxes are, of course, going to be our peasants and our serfs. They are going to be unable to pay these taxes. And so now peasants that had money that weren't in debt now fall into serfdom, and serfs now are even further plagued by debt. And the only place, if you were someone that was working in or around St. Petersburg, the only place now you have become a serf, and the only place where you can work is Peter is going to say, come and work in my shipyards in St. Petersburg. Come build these ships. And so he intentionally raises taxes in order to get serfs, make more serfs, and then come in and build his navy. And so obviously, Peter is going to have a tremendous impact on not just the economy of Russia, but also the social structure of Russia, because of all of these people that are now serfs and that are now more impressed than ever. More from Peter. So obviously, Peter, very, very important. He is going to work to administer his empire. And this is exactly what we've seen in England and France. With England, we have our justices of the peace. In France, we have our intendants. In Russia, Peter is going to divide up Russia into provinces, and each province is going to be ruled by a provincial official that is paid with a salary and not through feeding off the land, which means not by coming in and taking bribes from the local nobles. He's also going to create a senate that when he is gone, they can help rule the country. And he left Russia often to go to Western Europe. And so who's going to rule in his stead? The Senate, these government officials that help rule Russia. So Peter, centralizing power, administering his empire, lots of contributions. Speaking of administering their empire, one of the states that we talked about already was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire has a very, very unique way of ruling over their people. They need to create bureaucrats. And the way in which they created bureaucrats, people that worked for the government, was the Devshirme. And I know we've talked about the Devshirme many times. This is a review for us. But if we look at the Ottoman Empire in this map right here, remember the Ottoman Empire is just that. It is an empire. It is controlling many different regions of the Middle East. As I move this slightly, it's coming down into the Arabian Peninsula. It's coming into Northern Africa. This is modern day Turkey here, but also it's coming into Southern Europe. And Southern Europe is populated largely by white Christians. And so this is land controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but that is a very, very different ethnic and religious makeup. And so the Ottomans, the government is going to use control of this Christian lands in order to create bureaucrats. It's fascinating. So what they're going to do is they're going to move into Southern and Eastern Europe down here, and they are going to abduct Christian boys. They're going to abduct boys ages 8 to 20, and they're going to take them back to Istanbul, and they're going to force them to convert to Sunni Islam, and they are going to train them from a very, very young age to be loyal to the Sultan and to train in the ways of bureaucracy for the Ottoman government, and to one day become a powerful and rich and wealthy bureaucrat for the Sultan, loyal to the Sultan. And by taking the boys this young, they are train them in this new lifestyle. They indoctrinate them so that this is what they know. This is the only thing they know. This is the only thing they train every day. They study the religious doctrines, and these people become incredibly loyal bureaucrats to the Ottoman government. And this system works very well for over 100 years. We see these very devout bureaucrats to the Ottoman sultans. But of course, this system can't last forever. Because eventually you're going to run out of boys to abduct from Southern and Eastern Europe, which was what starts to happen. And the other thing is that you're going to develop a tremendous amount of resentment for the people that you keep abducting their children from, which is why the Ottomans start to be attacked by their neighbors, especially their neighbors, in Europe. Why Christian boys? The Ottomans considered Muslims and Jews to be peoples of the book, and they actually also used to consider Christians to be peoples of the book. The Ottoman government, however, didn't, because of all of their constant warring with Christians in the Holy Land in the Crusades, and then against the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. Dev Sharma, okay, not only is it abducting people, but the people that were abducted, you would think, oh my gosh, what a terrible life these people must have. But interestingly enough, a lot of these Christian boys that were abducted started to become the highest people in Ottoman society. They were trained at a young age in politics, arts, maybe military training. They were given education at the government's expense. And because of this, they would become the bureaucrats of the empire, scribes, tax collectors, or perhaps you would achieve the highest possible position, which were the janissaries. Our janissaries were these special military forces that are loyal only to the Sultan. And they were considered the highest in society because not only did they serve the government, or not only were they highly trained bureaucrats, but they also extended Islam. Because this position was so well respected, some Christian parents in the Balkans area, in these Christian areas, actually wanted their children to be abducted because they knew that they perhaps would have a better life of upward mobility. Okay, almost done with this portion of the lecture. I'm going to break up this lecture into 2 lectures because it's a very long lecture. I want to give you guys a little bit of a break. But Ottoman and Mughal taxation. So we talk about tax farming, and tax farming is a specific type of farming. Give me 1 second. My dog is scratching to go outside. All right, buddy. Little crash dog. Okay. Anyways, tax farming. So tax farming was a way in which some of our gunpowder empires collected taxes. And we've actually seen this in other places of the world, but this is where the government wants to help collect taxes in places where it's difficult because the people are more loyal to nobles or regional leaders than the government itself. And so what the government will do was they will have these tax farmers, sometimes the nobles in these regions themselves, to collect taxes, and then they have to pay just a portion of those taxes to the government. And so this is an indirect method of taxing. It works if you're trying to collect taxes from people that are loyal to, regional leaders, but there can be some problems with this as well. Sometimes these tax farmers start collecting more taxes than they should, And that can create rebellions and problems. We see this later in the Mughal Empire. After Akbar, the Zamindars start to collect more power and taxes for themselves. And the other problem with this is that all of these tax collectors want to make money. And if they're stationed in cities with high population, they're going to make a lot of money. But sometimes they're stationed in these small agricultural villages. And so these agricultural villages are going to be burdened with high taxes because these tax farmers want to make money from them. And so there was unequal tax distribution under tax farming. And there's also the possibility of corruption. And of course, this style, this method, is going to lead to problems in the gunpowder empires of corruption and not enough loyalty to the Sultan. Tax collection in the Ming Dynasty in China, the major form of tax collection, nobles collected taxes and then paid it to the federal government. Mostly the people, the peasants that are working on the nobles' lands are going to pay in the form of grains. But after we started to see silver be used as currency, after the bringing of the Spanish silver across into Portugal, traded at Manila to the Chinese, they later started using silver. And we see that the Chinese, for most of their existence, had many, many surplus years in which they were collecting more taxes than they needed. They would take all of this grain, they would store it in warehouses. However, during the Ming Dynasty and then later the Qing Dynasty, we have all of these expensive wars, and that actually causes these surpluses to turn into deficits. We start to see China running out of wealth and money. And our last little section before I give you guys a little bit of a break. So we have in Europe, we have the creation of art, the creation of divine kings, and they use art to glorify their rule. Kind of summaries here: France, Louis XIV, Palace of Versailles. Not only does it glorify his power, he also keeps to watch over the nobles. Peter the Great, St. Petersburg, it's built after Western European style. Later, the Winter Palace is built there. This is going to glorify the power of the czars. In India, we see the Taj Mahal, which is not only going to be built as a tomb for Shah Jahan's wife, it's also going to glorify the power of the Shahs in India. It's also an example of syncretism. And then in Istanbul, which of course is in the Ottoman Empire, we have Mehmed II build Topkapi Palace, and we have Suleiman I build the Suleimani Mosque. Okay, this is where I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to teach my APUsh class, and then I will circle back and do the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation lecture has the DBQ outline at the end of it. All right, guys, I hope this was mostly review and you found it interesting. I will post my next video shortly.